So thank you for that very nice introduction. There's actually another institution you can add to that now, which is Cumbria University, where I've recently moved house. So another one on the long list. I think I'm going to stop now.
Yes, leave some jobs for the other people.
So thank you, Helen, for that launch. And annoyingly, you practically stole my presentation, so I could just sit down now, really, and you'd still know everything.
Morning to you.
So why gender still? Because, as Helen said, you're often presented with this this very familiar phrase, haven't we gone past this, or isn't gender very 1980s, or etc. I can see those of you in the room probably split in terms of those who are completely on board with this and really see the need, and the others who are here to be convinced. So let's hope after the 2 days that everybody leaves fully convinced of the need, yes, for diversity broadly, but I'm going to focus mostly on gender. So I was asked to just talk about how things were in the dim and distant past in the 1990s when I began this work, actually, 1988, and the setting up of the Gender and Disaster Network, and then how we kind of moved forward, the extent to which ideas have changed or developed or not. And this continuing need for attention to gender, but also particularly the need to build up the evidence base. We already have a lot, but as I'll speak about in a moment, there are gaps, and there are many people we still need to convince, and evidence is just one way of helping us convince them of our argument. So the continuing need for analysing according to gender, amongst other things, yes, but... So let me begin then with invisible women in the 1990s. And can I just check at the back, can you hear me? Oh, good, a few hands waving. I hope you can see the slides, which are a bit wordy, mostly because I never have notes, and my notes are the slides. But also, I think you will have them available to you afterwards in case you would like to take away some of those points. So in the 1990s, a number of us were struggling with this feeling that we were working on hazards, emergencies, disasters, but gender was nowhere to be seen. That the whole area of gender was undocumented in the work that we were looking at. And a bunch of us got together to try and do something about that, because mostly because we were all a bit lonely, really. We had all felt that we were the only one facing this huge gap, and then we began to slowly come together. Particularly, there was very little evidence around gender differences in emergencies and disasters in more economically developed countries. And to an extent that is still the same. And there is still this idea that if you want to look at gender, the gender problems are not with us. The gender problems are somewhere else, and usually in lower and lower middle income countries. But those of us who had worked in social science particularly and saw the gender differences in the everyday realized if they're in the everyday, I'm pretty sure they're going to be in a disaster or an emergency situation as well. It's just that we have not captured that yet. We're also faced with very few women in emergency, disaster management professions and the allied professions, apart from health, of course, which always attracted more women. And normally in a disasters conference, I would be saying, it's a shame there aren't more women present. But in this one, I have to say, it's a shame there aren't more men present, because if you look around the room, this is not the usual kind of demographic in a disasters or emergency management conference. So we met in the hazards workshop, the natural hazards workshop at Boulder, Colorado, which is an interesting place. Has anyone been there? I know Deb has been there. Has anyone been to that meeting?
I've not been meeting, I've been to Boulder.
We've been to Boulder, okay. Well, great. It's a meeting that tries to bring together the academics and the practitioners to build a bridge between the languages of those two groups. And a bunch of us were there, going fairly regularly, and we decided at that meeting that we would launch a network, just because we needed to be connected. Hence the Gender and Disaster Network, born in 1997. Over on the right, you won't be able to read all of that detail, you don't need to, but over on the right is the original sign-up sheet for that meeting in 1997. There's 36 names on it, 5 are men. Take from that what you will. We set it up to start sharing information, but also to begin to reach out and take that message further. So it's still going. We had our 20th birthday last year, which you might think is a great success story, but personally I think it's a bit of a disaster that we're still around, that we still need to be around, that we haven't done ourselves out of a job. But it is still around. There's a usual fairly constant, roughly 1,000 membership. People come and go as they move through their careers. But we set out to be a group that connected online, very occasionally face-to-face. And are there any Gender and Disaster Network members in the room? Great, I know the usual suspects down the front here, but do come and say hello later in the tea break. So we're a very broad church, as they say. We are open to everyone, regardless of who you are, even though people automatically equate gender with women. We're much broader than that. And it's 99% voluntary, like a lot of groups that do a lot of good work. We very rarely have any money. We just get on and do it. Now that means there are lots of things we can't do because we just don't have the resources. So if anyone's got any money, sacks of money under the table, or come see me in the tea break. But it shows a degree of commitment, and we've still got a lot of the founder members who are still involved in the network, but a lot of new people as well. So we do a whole lot of things. It's mainly a repository. We want to gather together what we can find. We want to put it on a website or send it out on the mailing list and share it with people. So if you've got reports or events or documents of any kind, or you've come across them, not just your own but others, and you think these are worth sharing, then do let us know. We are a global entity, but we do have regional hubs around the world, and we do have a Pacific Oceania regional hub. that is mostly hosted outside from Massey University. But actually, we are talking about launching an Australia country hub. And if you're interested in taking the kinds of things we do on the Gender and Disaster Network, but with a more regional and local face, then do come and talk to myself or Deb and JC Gayal about that. You'd be very welcome. So one of the things we do is to try and advocate around policy. And we've worked quite a lot at the global UN system level, which can seem extremely remote from the everyday, but it does lead to a commitment, a policy commitment, at the highest levels of government of the member states, and that tends to filter down through the policy levels and through the different sectors. So the last major event was the 2015 meeting in Sendai in Japan, out of which came the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. How many of you have ever heard of that? Well, that's not a sight you see every day. Great. I say great, but it's full of holes, but we'll get to that. So it's worth starting somewhere. It doesn't mean we stop there, but we start there. We usually have a booth, the Gender and Disaster Network booth in the marketplace at these big events where we try and pass on some of our materials and our ideas. But behind the scenes, we're part of the Women's Major Group. We actually tried to change the title, but it's still the Women's Major Group, where we are involved in the negotiating process to try and get the right things in these policy frameworks. We must have been years, actually, years of trickling through and arguing our case and sitting through meetings that my students, who I encouraged to sit through one once, said, "Maureen, those meetings are so boring." They are long, dense meetings looking at text and arguing over words, but it's really important. And so after months of negotiating, I've cut these slides down a bit because I'm aware that you can't see absolutely everything very well on the screens, but this is some of the text that we managed to get into the Sendai framework. So we angled from the start that groups should be named, not just talking about people in this generic way. Because if you don't identify the groups, whoever they are, then they're invisibilized. And this was a battle that went on literally to the last minute, to the night before the agreement of Sendai, when one of the last negotiating committees, after we had campaigned for years to have a rather long list of people mentioned, was still saying, do we really need all these names on here? Can't we just say people? No. So we've got women mentioned specifically, and we're much better at listening to people's experiences from outside our own cultures and our own countries and our own worlds. But still there is some resistance to feeling that this is not for us. So in that time, we had very few examples from the more economically developed countries around gender that we could use to persuade emergency managers that there was anything worth looking at here. and we could talk about, and I'm sure you'll share some of your experiences or ask questions around those kinds of issues later. But we still don't have enough in the UK. I mean, if you probably can't read that, but I was just looking for the emergency preparedness guidelines, the UK government emergency preparedness guidelines, and doing a search with gender. And so if you see where the arrow is pointing and it says gender missing, you're much better at this actually than we are. So I'm a bit of a fraud standing here because your streets ahead actually. I know some of you are going to go, no, we're not. But you are compared to what's happening in the UK. And if there's anyone here who can persuade me otherwise, I would be really happy to be persuaded otherwise. But I think there's a lot that the UK can learn from the work that you're doing here. And I also think that this meeting is something of a watershed meeting because of the mix of people, of interests and topics that are here. This will be a meeting that excites a lot of attention and interest, I think. So, okay, we move forward a bit. We're learning more. We're seeing some change. We're gathering more information. So at the last UNISDR global platform for disaster risk reduction in Cancun in Mexico, Gender and Disaster Network put together some posters. We, and JC Gaia, one of our speakers, was a part of that group. Also Ben Wisner and Cheney Shreve and I. We tried to think, well, what were the dominant terms that were in use in the 1990s when the Gender and Disaster Network was launched? We looked through some journals, we looked through all the policy documents, and Ben and I could remember what it was like then. And certain key words sort of jumped out, really. We were still very focused on hazard. And the word natural cropped up again and again. Natural disasters. Man-made, that's one of my bête noire, man-made. It's one of those phrases that when the students use it, it gets the red pen through it. And if we were thinking about any subgroup, let's say, a marginal group, we were thinking in terms of vulnerability. Then, through the decade of the 2000s, it started to change a bit. It was still very much a needs-based approach. It was still, women are a problem. They have these needs, these bodily needs around reproduction. And we need to do something about that. And we also need to protect them and rescue them. That's really the language around there. But little by little, as well as vulnerability, the words capacity or capability started to come in. After a lot of advocacy, I have to say, by a number of people, trying to recognize that women and other groups, but women as our focus today, aren't just vulnerable. We may make them vulnerable. Society may create conditions that make them vulnerable, but they also have a number of capacities, and I'm sure I don't need to explain that to you. So gender started to appear a bit more. Then 2010s, where we still are, we have started to see a lot more diverse language creeping in. Rights-based approaches are appearing more often, still uncomfortable language for some people, but it's there. Also, and as a result of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, there's more of an emphasis on women's leadership roles. So not just add women and stir into this mix, but to consider also the position of women in whatever example we might be talking about. And we know that across the board there's a big lack of women's leadership role. Also, much more diverse and LGBTQI groups, plus groups, beginning to become more visible. This is really early days, and it's a real struggle. And on the global stage, of course, it's a major struggle, because in many countries in the world, it would be illegal. So it's very hard for people like yourselves to try and put it into policy documents when it goes against the law to do so. Gender-based violence has steadily grown in visibility and priority. And that also is on the basis of a lot of advocacy work. So the ideas have changed slowly. We have moved more towards this idea of disasters being socially constructed. Over on the right is my colleague Kevin Blanchard's hashtag on Twitter, disasters are not natural. Keep calm and repeat after me. So we're moving away from a needs-based to a rights-based approach, but we do still tend to think and focus on one issue. So I'm a bit constrained today because I'm told to talk about gender, but I don't usually stay in that box, and I want you to think, and this whole conference actually is about thinking outside the box. There is an academic term, of course, you know, being an academic, we like words, the longer the better, and here's a nice long one, intersectionality, or intersectionally, think intersectionally. So if you look at that image, you know, what is it that you are seeing? Not that you can see it very clearly, but you might identify it's a woman, an older woman, minority woman, a vulnerable woman. One wonders how she would be describing herself. So if we go beyond just the head, how about now? We suddenly see this woman in a different way, and so the box that we put her in originally might have changed, maybe. So she's a lot of things, but generally not vulnerable. However, she could be placed in a vulnerable situation. And I guess that's where the intersection comes, where we might be able to do something about it. Here, again, what do you see? And now, see just that person's head within the whole picture. And here's a person who's identifying as part of the LGBT community. And the problems lie at these intersections, because we may have put this person in the wrong box. She actually may be in a number of boxes, but the one that we focus on might be the wrong factor. We might be dealing with the wrong problem. Because people have these overlapping identities. They're not just one thing. If you think about yourself, how would you identify? It's probably not just as one thing. And you're looking at me up here and putting me in a box. I hate to think what one it is, but we'll move on from that. So the context can change what box we put people in. And people can have identities that they choose themselves, or they can have them ascribed to them, given to them. And I wonder just how often the identity that we have chosen and ascribed to someone coincides with their own elective one. I will refrain from an aside there because I know I'll run out of time. So evidence building. The evidence base is growing, yes, but it's got many gaps. So we've got some good data now emerging around women and disasters. A lot of it is qualitative, and that's great as far as I'm concerned. I'm 90%, how can I say this? I'm 90% qualitative researcher. Just realised how ridiculous that sounds. I should stop saying that. But we don't have very much that's quantitative. And if you're trying to win an argument, it's very easy for those who are resisting that argument to knock you down if you only have something qualitative to present to them. They like numbers. We've got very little data on men and disasters specifically, because gender equals women. We've got hardly any data on other social categories, and practically nothing where a number of these things intersect. We particularly lack this kind of data for the kind of country that we're in and that I'm from, and for other economically developed countries where there is this sense it's not our problem. So, sorry about the small text. So some of what we think we know, and I've only chosen a few kind of headlines from Australia, US, UK, Japan. So we know that men and women perceive risk and response actions differently, with women being typically more risk averse. We know that practically everywhere women are excluded or underrepresented in emergency management decision making, and certainly leadership positions, or you wouldn't believe it if you look around this room now. There are these single cases or small numbers of cases where we have some evidence and we still need to really work through that and explain it. So, why is it that more older women died in heat waves and earthquakes in France, in Japan, and why more men died in heat waves in Chicago in 1995, for example. We know from work in Katrina that gender, race and class combine to make poor black women particularly impacted in that disaster. We know that violence against women is significant during and after disasters, and before, of course. And we also know that the services that are there to service women and their families in distress are overstretched and under-resourced. And we know just about everywhere again that it's not men that are the problem, it's these stereotypical masculine roles, attitudes. These put men at risk, not just women. And the men fail to seek help, particularly health advice, when they need it. We don't know a lot. We don't have good baseline data. We don't have very much gender disaggregated data. We don't have good disaggregated data in unusual areas. I've mentioned infrastructure or digital worlds there. We lack good coverage. So what we have is a bit spotty, gappy, so we can't generalize often. And the gender and disaster rhetoric only takes you so far. So we've managed to convince people that there may be an issue, But then what people are really crying out for is, so what do I do with that? You've just told me that, but what do I do with it in my day-to-day work? And that's a plug for the new Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines, more to come. More of what we don't know. Why is it that women and men perceive risk and response differently? Is it something in people's heads to do with perception? Or is it just the way we're socialised and it's a pragmatic response? There's all sorts of questions that we need to ask. I'm not going to carry on through all of those. But I would direct you, if you haven't read them already, but I would direct you to the literature review that goes with the guidelines as well, because there's lots of good material in there. So even after 20 years of the Gender and Disaster Network, we realised we need much more solid, robust evidence. So we launched a research centre at University College London, the IRDR Centre for Gender and Disaster. And you won't be able to read that either. In fact, I can barely read it. Apologies for that. But we decided there's a lot to do, but we'll just focus on 5 pillars of research at the moment. So social justice, equality and equity, get the fundamentals covered. But also to look at engineering and infrastructure. How often do we look at rebuilding, reconstructing, or just developing new areas, new towns, new communities from a diverse perspective, but particularly from a woman's perspective with multiple roles, etc. Transformative technologies, how can we harness technology? The issue around data, we need much more work on that. And health and well-being, we have more on that than we have on most things. And we work with our sister centre at University College London, the Centre for Gender and Global Health on that. But we focus on the disaster bit. So it's a pretty unique centre, actually. And with these unusual domains of interest around infrastructure and engineering and other things. We're in a faculty of mathematical and physical scientists, which is also odd, because normally this kind of work is in social science faculty. But then they all go, yeah, we've heard that before. So you talk to the mathematicians, the geologists, geoscientists, engineers, etc. And it's a bit of a wake-up call for them. They're going, wow, I hadn't thought of that before. So it's actually a good place to be. It's international, it's interdisciplinary, it's intersectional, and we're going to try and take this kind of critical approach to taken for granted terms. So we don't accept the standard definitions for any of the words that we usually use. We're going to really explore them more closely. Gender, disaster, vulnerability, resilience, all of those. We've got a lot of already associates and partners around the world, and we're quite well represented over here, and hopefully we will soon be a lot more represented if we launch the Australia Country Hub for Gender and Disaster Network, and we start to plan some joint collaborative research. So the continuing need, and I'm winding up now, for those of you feeling a bit fidgety.
15 minutes.
Is gender still relevant? Well, I think, you have to look at how we see women and girls. We're tending to focus on the reproductive role. We tend to think of them as vulnerable and at risk. There's the problem of objectifying women's bodies and girls' bodies increasingly, sexualization of girl children, women, girls to be taken care of, and the limited options, career options, professional options, life chances, comparatively for women and girls. So, these kind of images, you don't see them very often. So when you say farmer, construction worker, fire officer, lorry driver, you're probably not thinking of a woman, apart from those in the room who are women, who probably had quite a struggle to get to the point that they're at now. How we see women and girls. Not every woman is exposed to risk in the same way. Not every woman is equally abled. Not every woman is heterosexual. Not every woman has or wants a child, etc., etc. Not every woman looks like or even wants to look like a babe. There are other images of women and girls that we should be seeing a lot more of. There's a current kind of vogue on TV, probably here as well, for babe-type professors, where most of us look like me. It's really annoying, I have to say. Why are you laughing? So every woman has more than one identity, but we tend to be just putting them in a box, and that's just looking at women. Is it still relevant? Look at the explosion that's happened around Me Too. Look at violence against women everywhere, Australia included, of course. And of course, violence doesn't stop in disasters. It doesn't necessarily start in disasters. It's part of background noise of our lives for most women. It's part of the background noise of everyday lives of men, but in very different ways, actually. So this is my last slide. You'll be pleased to say, here. I'm talking really about this sort of gender-responsive resilience. But it's not always women. It's not always and only about vulnerability. It's not always and only about blame, because I think there's a problem that when men hear the gender and disaster presentations or advocacy messages, they feel obliged to get on the defensive because we're on the attack. But as I said earlier, it's not men so much as masculinity that we are arguing about. It's always fundamentally about inclusivity, about rights, about justice. So, if there's still any of you out there who need persuading, I would say, to join us, because at the heart of it, it's only fair. We're talking about, we can't say 50% of the population, but it's a considerable number of the population we're talking about that in many ways our services that we're providing invisibilize that group's experiences, their needs and their interests, and particularly their rights. So join us, it's only fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you.